She married him at 21. He was the most powerful man in American media, 19 years older, already restless. For 2 decades, he gave her 5 sons, the largest media fortune in the country, and the keys to a 30-room apartment on Riverside Drive. Then he gave her a public humiliation that lasted 40 years. He moved his mistress into a California castle. He paraded her in his own newspapers. He asked again and again for the divorce. And the showgirl from a Manhattan tenement, who had been taught by her own life that a woman owns nothing she cannot defend, looked at the most powerful man in America and said no. For 4 decades. If you find yourself drawn to the women history has filed away under their husbands' names, subscribe so the next story finds you when it lands. Chapter 1. The showgirl who caught the wrong man's eye. She was 15 years old, kicking her legs in a chorus line at the Herald Square Theater, when the 34-year-old man in the 3rd row decided he would have her. It was the spring of 1897. The show was a touring production called The Girl from Paris by the impresario Edward E. Rice, and the chorus number that brought her on stage with her older sister Anita was called The Bicycle Girls. The Wilson sisters were billed in the program as members of a dancing troupe called the Merry Maidens. The columns of the New York theatrical press described them as graceful and pleasing to the eye. The columns did not name them individually. There was no reason yet, in the spring of 1897, for any New York theater column to learn the name Millicent Veronica Wilson. She had been born on the 16th of July, 1882, in New York City. The younger daughter of George Wilson, a vaudeville performer of modest reputation, and Hannah Murray Wilson, a homemaker of Irish Catholic descent. The family lived in a working-class district of Manhattan, near the theaters where George earned his living, and the household ran on the irregular wages of a stage father in the years before vaudeville had its great commercial expansion. The girls were sent to the parish school. They were given piano lessons. They were taught, by the time they could walk, the basic geography of a stage. Anita, 2 years older, started in chorus work first. Millicent followed almost immediately. By 15, she had been on a Broadway stage. She had been photographed in a costume. She had earned her own first money. The man in the 3rd row was William Randolph Hearst, born on the 29th of April, 1863, in San Francisco, the only son of George Hearst, a Comstock Lode mining magnate and recently deceased United States Senator, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, the schoolteacher heiress who had inherited her husband's multi-million-dollar fortune 6 years earlier. By the spring of 1897, William Randolph Hearst was 34. He had been publishing the San Francisco Examiner for 10 years. He had purchased the New York Morning Journal in 1895. He had launched the previous year the New York Evening Journal. The newspaper war between Hearst's Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's World was already the most expensive and the most ferocious media contest in American history. He courted her, by the standards of his class, conservatively. He arrived at her family's flat with flowers. He took her, with Anita as chaperone, to restaurants suitable for an unmarried girl of her age. He paid the rent on a better apartment for the Wilson family in 1899. He paid for travel. He paid for theater tickets. He paid throughout for Millicent's wardrobe. The arrangement was understood by the family. It was also understood by every chorus girl on every stage in Manhattan. Mr. Hearst, the wealthy young publisher, had chosen the younger of the Wilson sisters. Mr. Hearst was prepared to wait. He waited 6 years. They were not married until the 28th of April, 1903, in a Catholic ceremony at the Catholic Church of the Holy Innocents on West 37th Street. She was 21. He was 40. By one day, she wore white. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The wedding was small for a man of his fortune, by his mother's instruction. Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who had previously broken her son's relationship with a Cambridge waitress named Tessie Powers in 1897, had spent 6 years steering her son away from the chorus girl. She had failed. She accepted the marriage and attended the ceremony. She did not pretend in the receiving line that she was pleased. The honeymoon was in Europe. They sailed in May. They moved into a small Manhattan house on his return. The first son, George Randolph Hearst, was born on the 23rd of April, 1904, 11 months after the wedding. The pattern of her early married life had been established. He worked, she conceived, he traveled, she managed. He was already, by the time of his first child's birth, the publisher of 7 newspapers across 5 American cities. He was already running, that year, for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. The chorus girl had married not just a wealthy publisher, she had married a candidate. She would learn, across the next decade, that what she had really married was a man whose appetite for attention, for possession, and for power could not be filled by a single household, by a single party affiliation, by a single woman. The candidate did not win the nomination of 1904. He came in second. He would run again. He would not stop. How did the girl from the chorus line end up holding the empire? The honest answer, which the rest of this documentary is going to take you carefully through, is that she did it not by chasing the empire, and not by holding the man, and not by competing with the women he would take afterwards. She did it by holding, with everything she had, the one thing that no court and no priest and no rival woman could ever again give away, the legal name he had stood at the altar and given her in 1903. Chapter 2. The Wedding That Built a Cage. When she married him on the 28th of April, 1903, she was 21 years old, and she was already learning that the man she had won was not strictly the man she had been promised. He had told her repeatedly across their 6-year courtship that he wanted a quiet domestic life. He had told her he wanted children. He had told her he wanted to be at home. None of these things turned out to be true in the sense that a young wife would understand the words. He worked 16-hour days. He traveled 3 months of the year. He kept an apartment in Manhattan, a townhouse on Riverside Drive, an apartment at the Clarendon, the family ranch at San Simeon in California, and the ancestral house in San Francisco. He was at none of them, on any given day, for more than a few hours. The first year of the marriage was spent in Europe and in New York. They lived initially in a series of large rented houses. She entertained for him when he asked her to. She did not entertain often. The press did not yet treat her as a society wife, and the great Manhattan hostesses of the Astor and Vanderbilt and Whitney circles did not call. The Hearst money was new money. The Hearst newspapers were considered vulgar. The Hearst political opinions, then aggressively democratic and populist, were considered unsafe. Millicent Hearst, the chorus girl wife, was at the edge of New York society and not yet inside it. Her first son arrived in April 1904. The birth was at home, with a doctor in attendance. The baby was named George Randolph Hearst, after the senator grandfather and the publisher father. The naming made her position in the family clear. She was the mother of the future. She would also, soon enough, be the mother of a great many futures. The second son, William Randolph Hearst Jr., arrived in 1908. The third son, John Randolph Hearst, arrived in 1909. The twins, Randolph Apperson Hearst and David Whitmire Hearst, arrived on the 2nd of December, 1915. By the age of 33, Millicent Hearst had borne 5 sons in 11 years. The Hearst households moved with the births. The Clarendon apartment, occupying parts of 3 top floors of the building at 137 Riverside Drive, was completed in 1908. It had 30 rooms. It had a private elevator. It had a music room large enough for a small orchestra. It had a dining room that could seat 30. It was decorated on Hearst's instructions in a heavy 19th century European style, with tapestries on the walls and armorial shields above the doorways. The press, when it described the apartment, described it as a palace. The press did not, however, photograph Millicent often in the first decade of the marriage. She was busy with the sons. She was photographed at christenings and at the occasional opera evening. She did not give interviews. She did not appear in the gossip columns. The chorus girl past was, by mutual family agreement, never to be mentioned. Hearst's papers did not mention it. Other papers mentioned it occasionally, in tones that ranged from kindly to sneering. Millicent did not respond. She had learned, from her years on the stage, that an audience that does not get a reaction will eventually move on. The husband did not move on. He moved across the country. The expansion of the Hearst Corporation across the early 1910s was one of the most rapid commercial expansions in American media history. By 1910, he owned 8 newspapers. By 1915, he owned 12. By 1920, he would own 20. Each acquisition required attention. Each new market required visits. The family residences he maintained in New York and in California became less and less a domestic arrangement and more a logistical one. He had a home in New York for the wife and the sons. He had a home in California for the ranch, the publishing operation, and his own personal life. He kept moving. Millicent stayed. She had begun, by the late 1910s, to understand what every other wife of a great American publisher had understood before her. The husband would not come home. The husband would not stop. The husband would, in a relatively short time, take an interest in another woman, and the only question that mattered was what the wife planned to do about it. Some wives, in the same position, retired to the country. Some wives took lovers of their own. Some wives drank. Some wives, like Alice Roosevelt Longworth, or like Edith Galt Wilson, built parallel political identities. Some wives, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, eventually filed for divorce and walked out. Most wives in the great American houses of the period did not divorce. Most wives stayed and built around the absence. Millicent did not yet know which kind of wife she was going to be. She was, in the late 1910s, still raising 5 sons. The youngest twins were toddlers. The eldest, George, was a teenager. She was running a household of 20 servants. She was managing the menus, the laundry, the children's tutors, the boys' schools, the doctors, the dressmakers, the social calendar, the holiday plans, and the husband who was rarely at home long enough to consult on any of it. She did not have time, yet, to commit to a long-term strategy against his eventual betrayal. What she did, in the years just before the betrayal arrived, was build the foundation. She joined the war effort. She organized. She gave speeches. She had her name placed in the newspapers by men of authority in a role that was, for the first time, entirely her own. By the time the betrayal arrived, the foundation was already poured. The mistress who walked into the picture in 1917 walked into a marriage Millicent had quietly converted into a fortress before she even knew she would need one. Chapter 3. 5 sons and 6 newspapers. Across 12 years, she gave him 5 sons. And across those same 12 years, his empire doubled, then trebled, then climbed to a scale the country had never seen. By 1917, 14 years into the marriage, the Hearst Corporation owned 20 newspapers in major American cities, 6 magazines including Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and Harper's Bazaar, the King Features Syndicate, 2 news agencies, and a film production company called Cosmopolitan Pictures. The annual revenue of the company exceeded $15 million, the equivalent today of approximately $380 million. Hearst himself, in the spring of 1917, was 54 years old, the most powerful private publisher in the United States, and the most controversial. His opposition to American entry into the First World War, his sympathy for German interests in 1915 and 1916, and his bitter long-running feud with President Wilson had made him, by the time the United States declared war that April, a publisher whose patriotism was being publicly questioned in editorials across the country. His wife, in that same April, made her decision. She would not retreat from public life. She would push into it. The patriotic ground that her husband was being accused of yielding, she would occupy. In 1917, Mayor John Hylan of New York appointed Mrs. William Randolph Hearst as chairman of the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense. The committee was a wartime body. Its task was to coordinate the mobilization of women's labor in New York City for the war effort. It operated a canteen for soldiers passing through Manhattan on their way to the troop ships. It ran patriotic rallies in Times Square and at Madison Square Garden. It distributed coal and milk and ice to the poor of the Lower East Side, Harlem, and the South Bronx. It coordinated, in cooperation with the Red Cross, knitting circles, bandage rolling sessions, and the production of soldiers' kits. Across the 18 months of American participation in the war, the committee under Millicent's chairmanship raised over $2 million, the equivalent today of approximately $50 million. The newspapers covered it daily. Her husband's papers covered it most extensively. But the New York Times, the World, the Tribune, and the Sun also covered it. The chorus girl wife had become, by the late summer of 1917, the most active society wife in wartime New York. She had become, by virtue of her committee, a public woman in her own right. The war ended in November 1918. The committee was wound up. Millicent, by then aged 36, had her platform. She did not surrender it. In 1921, 3 years after the armistice, she founded the Free Milk Fund for Babies. The fund was registered as a charitable corporation under the laws of New York State. Its purpose was to supply free pasteurized milk to infants and children in the poorest districts of New York City. Its first year of operation distributed approximately 150,000 quarts of milk through a network of settlement houses, parish missions, and city clinics. By 1930, the fund was distributing more than 1 million quarts a year. By 1940, more than 3 million. By the time it wound up in the 1960s, it had distributed, across half a century, an aggregate quantity of milk to New York's poor children of well over 100 million quarts. The annual benefits of the Free Milk Fund became, in the 1920s, central events of the New York charity season. The first benefits were held at the Manhattan Opera House. By the early 1930s, the annual gala had moved to the Metropolitan Opera House at Broadway and 39th Street. The conductor was the music director of the Metropolitan. The performers were the principal singers of the season. Tickets were sold at prices ranging from $5 to $100, with private boxes available for the larger donors. The galas were attended by every name on the New York social register, by mayors and governors, by visiting royalty including, in later years, King Paul and Queen Frederica of Greece, and by the philanthropic peers Millicent had carefully courted, including Eleanor Roosevelt. The peak of the foundation, in social terms, was the late 1920s. By that point, Millicent Hearst had been the wife of William Randolph Hearst for a quarter century. She had borne him 5 sons. She had run his Manhattan household. She had attended his political campaigns when he had run for mayor in 1905 and 1909, and for governor in 1906, all of which he had lost. She had managed, through patient and unending charitable work, to build for herself a separate and distinct public identity. She was not just Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. She was the Free Milk Fund Hearst. She was the Mayor's Committee Hearst. She was, in the columns of the rival press, Mrs. Millicent Hearst. In that same period, on a stage 4 miles south of the Free Milk Fund offices, a 19-year-old chorus girl from Brooklyn was learning a routine for the Ziegfeld Follies of 1917. Her name was Marion Cecilia Duras. She had taken the stage name Marion Davies. She had a slight stutter that her dancing teacher was helping her control. She had a great deal of natural charm. She was the youngest of 5 children of a Brooklyn magistrate. She had recently been spotted by William Randolph Hearst, who had been visiting the Follies as a publisher friendly to its proprietor, Florin Ziegfeld. Hearst, 54, was making the same arrangements he had made 20 years earlier with Millicent. He was paying for the better apartment. He was paying for the wardrobe. He was paying, in the case of Davies, for film acting lessons. He was preparing, although he would not have admitted it in those terms even to himself, to do to his wife exactly what he had not done to her mother in 1897. The empire that Millicent had married into had become the empire she would have to defend her position within. The mistress who would force the defense was already in the chorus line. The act would end here, on the cusp of 1918, with Marion Davies stepping into the Cosmopolitan Pictures contract that would change every subsequent year of Millicent's life. Chapter 4. The Other Showgirl. He had married one chorus girl in 1903, and in 1917, having tired of her, he went looking for another one. Marion Davies was 19. She was working in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1917, which had opened at the New Amsterdam Theater on the 12th of June, 1917, running through the autumn. Hearst, by his own admission in later letters to friends, attended the show repeatedly. He sent flowers. He paid attention. By the autumn, he had been introduced to Davies through her older sister Rose, who had told the family that the wealthy publisher was friendly. By the end of the year, Hearst had arranged for Davies a screen test at his Cosmopolitan Pictures studio. In 1918, Cosmopolitan Pictures signed Davies to a $500 a week exclusive contract. The figure was substantial. $500 a week in 1918, when the average American worker earned about $20 a week, was the equivalent today of approximately $10,000 a week, or roughly $520,000 a year. Davies left the Follies. She moved into the publicity machine Hearst had built across 2 decades. Her films were promoted in every Hearst newspaper. Her photographs ran in every Hearst magazine. By 1924, 6 years after the contract was signed, Davies was the #1 female box office star in Hollywood. Her films, When Knighthood Was in Flower in 1922 and Little Old New York in 1923, were the highest-grossing productions of their years. The relationship was, in the late 1910s, a private one. Davies lived in an apartment in Manhattan that Hearst had paid for. He visited her there in the evenings. He took her to dinners, to private screenings, and to small gatherings at the homes of theatrical and film acquaintances. He did not take her to the houses of the men he did business with, and he did not take her, ever, to the Clarendon apartment where his wife and his 5 sons lived. Millicent, by every account that survives, knew about the arrangement within a year of the contract. She did not respond. She did not, on the record, ever respond. What she did instead was learn the details. She had friends in the New York theatrical community from her own chorus days. She had friends in Hollywood through the social network of the Hearst Corporation. She had friends in the press through her own foundation work. She had, in effect, an intelligence apparatus that ran parallel to her husband's papers, and the apparatus reported to her on Marion Davies for the next 30 years. She knew which films were being made. She knew which parties were being held at the Santa Monica beach house Hearst had built for Davies in 1922, a 110-room Georgian mansion on the Pacific, costing approximately $7 million in contemporary value. She knew which Hollywood lovers Davies had taken across the years, including, by widely reported account, an affair with Charlie Chaplin in the mid-1920s that almost broke the Hearst-Davies arrangement entirely. She knew everything. She said nothing. The reason for the silence was tactical. To respond in any way was to confirm. To confirm, even by indignation, was to legitimize. The American press, including her husband's, would have been thrilled to print a Mrs. William Randolph Hearst denouncement of Marion Davies. The press would not have been able to print one if she did not say one. Across 30 years, she did not say one. She did not give a single quotable sentence. She did not write a letter that surfaced in print. She did not respond when Hearst's enemies in publishing, including Joseph Pulitzer Jr. and the Robert R. McCormick Organization in Chicago, attempted on multiple occasions to draw her into public statement. The silence was, by any reasonable reading, the discipline of a woman who had decided that the long game was the only game she was going to play. There was a moment, in 1924, when she nearly broke. She was at the family ranch at San Simeon. Davies was also present. The two women were in the same compound for the only documented overlap of their lives. Hearst, by his own later admission, had not arranged it well. He had been preparing the construction of what would become Hearst Castle. He had needed Millicent on site for certain estate decisions. He had not been able to ask Davies to leave. The visit lasted 3 days. Millicent did not speak directly to Davies. Davies, by her own memoir, said only that the visit was, in her phrase, awkward. Millicent left. She did not return to the ranch for any further visit ever again. By 1925, Hearst had moved most of his personal time to California. He had ceased visiting New York, except on business. He was, in effect, if not in declaration, living with Davies. Millicent, in Manhattan, was running the Free Milk Fund. She had ceased entertaining her husband at the Clarendon. He had ceased to come. The two of them were not yet, in the formal sense, separated. The marriage had become the arrangement it would remain for the rest of his life. The wife on the Hudson, the mistress at San Simeon, 5 sons moving between them. The legal name on the marriage certificate, untouched. She was 43 years old. He was 62. The marriage was 22 years in. The mistress was 28. The next 30 years had already taken their architecture. Chapter 5. The year. She stopped crossing the Mississippi. By 1926, the question was no longer whether the affair was real, but whether Millicent Hearst would publicly admit she had lost. She had not lost, in her own assessment. She had been displaced from one residence. She had not been displaced from her name, her sons, or her position. The reason she stopped crossing the Mississippi that year had nothing to do with surrender. It had to do with the calculation of what she was prepared to be photographed standing next to. San Simeon, by 1926, had become Marion Davies' house. The construction of La Cuesta Encantada, the architectural compound on the Central California coast that would in time be called Hearst Castle, had been underway since 1919. By 1926, the Casa Grande, the main house with its twin towers based on a Spanish cathedral, was substantially complete. The guest cottages, the gardens, the swimming pools, the menagerie of exotic animals, including zebras and giraffes, the indoor Roman pool tiled in 22-karat gold, the dining hall hung with 17th century tapestries, all were either complete or in active construction. The compound covered 250 acres on a hilltop with views to the Pacific. It cost, by the time work was halted in 1947, approximately $75 million, the equivalent today of well over $1 billion. It was, in 1926, the most opulent private residence under construction in the United States. It was also, indisputably, the residence at which Marion Davies served as hostess. The guests of the late 1920s at San Simeon were the most powerful figures in American film, business, and politics. Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Cary Grant, Calvin Coolidge, Winston Churchill on his 1929 visit, Bernard Shaw on his 1933 visit, Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, Howard Hughes, the novelist Anita Luce, the screenwriter Frances Marion, the columnist Luella Parsons, who was on the Hearst payroll. All of them were greeted at the door by Marion Davies in her capacity as the woman of the house. The guest book was kept by Davies. The seating plans were arranged by Davies. The menus were ordered by Davies. Millicent could not be photographed at the same table. To attend would have been to attend in the role of guest in the house her husband's mistress was running. The position was structurally impossible. Millicent worked it out in the spring of 1926 and made the decision that would govern her movements for the next 30 years. She would not visit San Simeon while Marion Davies was on the property. The unstated condition meant, in practice, that she would not visit at all because Davies was almost always on the property. The Mississippi River became the line. East of the Mississippi was her territory, west of it was his. The country was big enough. What she did in New York that year and across the years that followed was double down on the institutional life she had been building since 1917. The Free Milk Fund expanded. The mayor's committee work continued. She joined the boards of additional charitable organizations, including the New York Foundling Hospital, the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New York, and several committees of the Red Cross. She was photographed at openings, at dinners, at hospital dedications, at parish events. She was photographed in her box at the Metropolitan Opera. She was photographed at the Saratoga races. She was photographed in the spring of 1927, christening her first granddaughter, Phoebe, the daughter of George Randolph Hearst. The photographs were never of her with Hearst. The photographs were never of her without one of her sons. The visual story being told, by the photographs Millicent allowed and the photographs she encouraged, was the story of a mother and a philanthropist, not the story of a wife. The press, including her husband's, cooperated with the story. The Hearst papers did not run photographs of Marion Davies and Mrs. William Randolph Hearst on the same page. The Hearst papers did not run articles juxtaposing them. The Hearst papers covered the Free Milk Fund in language that called Millicent the leading philanthropist in New York and called the fund the most successful charitable initiative in the city. The Hearst papers also covered Marion Davies's films, premieres, parties, and gowns in language that called her the leading lady of American film and the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. The two parallel coverages, separated by editorial firewall, ran for 30 years. In the summer of 1928, at the height of her foundation work, Millicent appeared at the annual benefit of the Free Milk Fund, wearing a diamond and platinum necklace that had been a wedding anniversary gift from her husband in 1908. The press described the necklace in detail. The press also described, in the same paragraph, the gown she wore, dark midnight blue, by Maine Bochet, with elbow-length white gloves and a single white orchid at her wrist. The accumulated effect was of a woman entirely in control of her own visual presentation. The columns called her the most distinguished hostess of the season. The columns did not, that night or any night, ask after her husband. She would do this every year for the rest of her active life. The annual gala, the diamonds, the Maine Bochet, or later the Charles James, or later still the Christian Dior, the orchid, the composed smile, the brief speech thanking the donors, the retirement to the private box. the departure by her own chauffeured car to the apartment at the Clarendon. Across the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and into the 1960s, she ran this presentation with the discipline of a long-running theatrical production. The press, including the rival papers her husband detested, cooperated. They had been given, by her own example, a storyline they could rely on, and her composure had given them, year after year, the photographs they wanted. Marion Davies, 3,000 miles west, did not have this kind of public role available to her. The Manhattan philanthropic world would not have her. The New York Society columns would not photograph her. She was confined by the structural fact of being a mistress to the Hollywood entertainment columns, which loved her, and to the Hearst papers, which adored her, and to the rest of the American press, which treated her as a curiosity. Davies, by all accounts a generous and warm woman, gave to charity quietly. She funded a children's clinic at UCLA, named for her, opened in 1952, and operating to this day. She was beloved by the people who knew her. She was, in the only metric that Millicent had decided to compete on, unable to enter the field at all. What Millicent had built by 1930 was a fortress. The Mississippi was the wall. The Free Milk Fund was the inner keep. The 5 Sons were the garrison. The diamonds and the orchid were the colors flown on the parapet. The husband, 3,000 miles to the west, could no more breach this fortress than he could be evicted from his own castle. He could only, year by year, attempt to negotiate terms. Chapter 6. The First Time. He asked her to leave. He sent his lawyers across the country with an offer he believed no rational woman could refuse, and the woman in the Riverside Drive apartment refused it without raising her voice. The exact dates of the early divorce overtures are difficult to fix. The Hearst family papers held at Berkeley contain references to negotiations beginning as early as 1927 and continuing intermittently through the early 1930s. The substance of the offers can be reconstructed from the surviving correspondence of the lawyers involved. The first formal offer, conveyed by Hearst's principal personal counsel, John Francis Nayland, to Millicent's lawyer, Frank S. Smithers, in the autumn of 1927, proposed the following arrangement. Millicent would receive outright ownership of the Clarendon apartment, the Sands Point country house on Long Island, an annual lifetime stipend of $250,000, the equivalent today of approximately $4.5 million, the sole custody of the 3 minor sons remaining at home, John, Randolph, and David, with George and William Jr. already grown, full freedom to retain the title Mrs. William Randolph Hearst until any future remarriage, and a discreet civil divorce to be filed in the state of Nevada. In exchange, Hearst would receive an uncontested divorce, full operational and corporate control of the Hearst Corporation and all its subsidiaries, sole title to San Simeon, Wintoun, St. Donat's Castle in Wales, and his various other real estate holdings, and the right, beginning 12 months after the divorce decree, to remarry. Millicent's counsel returned the offer with a single-sentence reply, written in his own hand, that read in full, "My client declines, with no counteroffer to follow at this time." The reply was conveyed in late November 1927. It was not accompanied by any explanation. It was not accompanied by any request for further information. It was a closing of a door. Hearst, by every account, was angered. He had calculated that the offer would be irresistible. The annual stipend was generous. The Clarendon apartment was the most prestigious private residence in Upper Manhattan. The Nevada divorce was a discreet path that involved no public testimony. He had expected acceptance. He had not, on his side of the country, paid sufficient attention to the structure of his wife's actual life. She did not need the apartment. She had it. She did not need the stipend. She received, as the wife of the publisher, comparable income through the ordinary marital channels. She did not need the divorce. She did not want, on theological, financial, or strategic grounds, to be the divorced ex-wife of William Randolph Hearst. She wanted to be Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. She had always wanted to be Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. The negotiations he was conducting did not understand on any level that the title was, for her, the substance of the marriage, and that any agreement that removed the title was an agreement that gave her nothing. A second offer arrived in 1930. The annual stipend, was raised to $400,000. The Clarendon was supplemented with an additional Manhattan property. The custody arrangements were sweetened with a college expense fund for the twins. The same closing reply, almost word for word, was returned. A third offer arrived in 1932. The annual stipend was raised to $600,000. Millicent's counsel was, by this point, instructed to begin including, in his replies, the polite suggestion that further offers along the same lines would not be entertained, but that an offer that recognized the actual scale of Millicent's commercial interests in the corporation might receive consideration. The suggestion was the first signal Hearst received that his wife was not, as he had believed, refusing the divorce on emotional or religious grounds. She was refusing it because she had a counter price, and she had not yet been offered it. What was the counter price? It was, by inference from the subsequent 1937 negotiation, ownership of one of the principal corporate properties. Cosmopolitan magazine, it would turn out, was the specific property. Hearst, in 1932, did not understand this. He continued to escalate the stipend. He continued to add real estate. He continued to negotiate as though his wife was holding out for more cash, when his wife was, in fact, holding out for capital. The miscommunication ran for years. Across the same period, the press began to notice the long absence of any documented Hearst marriage scene. The Time magazine of the early 1930s ran occasional speculation. The Walter Winchell column in the Daily Mirror, owned by Hearst's rival, the New York Daily Mirror, until Hearst bought the Mirror in 1932, ran several blind items about the legendary West Coast newspaperman, whose marriage was a structural fiction. None of the items used names. None of them needed to. The country by then knew. The country also by then was watching to see how the negotiation would resolve. The negotiation did not resolve. It paused. The early 1930s were difficult for the Hearst Corporation. The Depression had cut national newspaper advertising by approximately 40% between 1929 and 1933. The Hearst papers, dependent on high-cost national advertising, suffered disproportionately. Hearst's personal spending on real estate and on the Davies film career continued in the early Depression years at pre-crash levels. The internal pressure on the corporation began, by the middle of the decade, to outrun its revenue. Hearst, who had refused for nearly 40 years to permit any outside committee to oversee his finances, began to find himself in a position where outside committees would not be optional. The pause in the divorce negotiations was not a pause in the marriage. The marriage continued. Davies remained at San Simeon. Millicent remained at the Clarendon. The sons continued to move between them. The pause was, instead, the closing of one chapter in the negotiation, in which Hearst had attempted to buy his wife out, and the opening of a different chapter, in which his wife had begun, with the patience of a woman who had been studying her husband for 30 years, to wait for the moment when she would name the price he could not refuse. The closer he came to losing the company, the more valuable her no became. Chapter 7. 1937. And the price. She named. When at last she said she might consider terms, she named a price so specific and so calculated that her husband, the most powerful publisher in America, walked away from the negotiation rather than meet it. The year was 1937. The Hearst Corporation was in serious trouble. Total corporate debt by the spring of 1937 was approximately $126 million. Annual revenues, which had peaked at approximately $120 million in 1929, had fallen by 1936 to approximately $75 million. The corporation could not continue to operate without restructuring. The directors, led by the lawyer Clarence J. Shern, imposed a conservation committee on the 26th of May, 1937. The committee took over the operating control of the corporation. William Randolph Hearst, for the first time since he had inherited the San Francisco Examiner in 1887, was no longer in charge of his own company. In the same year, Hearst initiated, through Nayland, the most substantial divorce offer he had yet made. The offer included, by the most reliable contemporary accounts, an annual stipend of $1 million, the equivalent today of approximately $22 million, full ownership of the Clarendon apartment, Sands Point, and a Hearst Corporation pension equivalent to a senior executive's salary for life. The offer also included the discreet Nevada divorce mechanism the earlier offers had proposed. Millicent, through Smithers, replied this time with substance. She would consider terms. She named her price. Cosmopolitan magazine. Cosmopolitan in 1937 was, by a substantial margin, the most profitable property in the Hearst magazine division. Its circulation that year was approximately 1,700,000. Its advertising revenue was estimated at $5.5 million annually. Its editorial costs were relatively low. Its profit margin was approximately 35%. It was a financial fortress in the middle of a financially failing empire. To give it up would have been to give up the most reliable single revenue stream the corporation still possessed. The demand was, on its face, audacious. The demand was also, on closer reading, an act of intimate and unforgiving familiarity. She had been married to him for 34 years. She had read every annual report the corporation issued. She had attended the dinner table conversations where Hearst told his sons which properties were performing and which were not. She had her own contacts inside the corporation, including the head of the magazine division. She knew to the dollar which property he could not afford to give her. She had asked with absolute precision for the one property whose loss would have most damaged him. Hearst, by every surviving account, was furious. He refused the offer within a week. He told Nayland to suspend the negotiations. He left no written record of the response that has been preserved, but the suspension is documented. The talks collapsed in late summer 1937. Millicent's lawyer Smithers conveyed to Nayland in the closing communication of the round that his client remained, as ever, willing to consider terms that recognized the scale of her interests, and that no further action would be initiated by her. She had said no 4 times. She had said no with a price the 5th time. Both kinds of no had worked. The press did not learn the specifics. The press learned that summer and autumn that the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. William Randolph Hearst remained intact. The press learned by other channels that the Hearst Corporation was in receivership in all but name. The press did not learn that the wife had, weeks earlier, declined to leave for any sum short of one of her husband's principal corporate properties. The wall of silence that Millicent had maintained for 20 years held also for this. She did not boast. She did not leak. She did not, even to her closest associates at the Free Milk Fund, acknowledge that the offer had been made. What had she learned in the course of the failed negotiation? She had learned, beyond any doubt, that her husband still wanted the divorce. She had learned that he was prepared to pay handsomely. She had learned that there was a ceiling above which he would not go. She had learned that the ceiling, however high it could be raised in cash terms, was below the value of his core operating assets. She had learned, in short, that her bargaining position would only get stronger as long as the corporation's troubles deepened, and that if she waited him out, the day would come when he could no longer pay any of the prices he was willing to pay. She waited him out. She also, in the meantime, watched her husband's body begin its slow decline. He was 74 in 1937. He was 77 by the time the war began. He was 80 by the time the war ended. The Conservation Committee, having stripped the corporation of its lavish overhead, gave back operating control to Hearst in 1945. The corporation, restructured, returned to profitability. The art collection, partly sold, was partly retained. The castles were both kept. The Saks Fifth Avenue antique sale of 1941, which had been the most public humiliation of the Hearst financial restructuring, had cleared the way for the company's recovery. By 1946, the company was earning more than it had earned in any year since 1929. Hearst, by then, was nearly blind in one eye. He had survived a series of cardiac episodes. He could no longer climb the stairs at San Simeon. He moved, with Marion Davies, into a leased Beverly Hills mansion at 10107 Beverly Drive in 1947. The mansion had a ground-floor bedroom, which San Simeon had not provided. The move was framed publicly as a temporary measure. It was not. He never returned to San Simeon. He spent the last 4 years of his life in a Beverly Hills bungalow that was, in scale and pretension, a fraction of the residence he had been building since 1919. He did not, in these years, raise the divorce question again. He could not, by the late 1940s, have raised it on terms that Millicent might accept. He had already lost most of the corporate flexibility he had once possessed. The Conservation Committee, even after returning operating control, had imposed permanent governance changes. The board now included independent directors. The major asset sales were no longer discretionary. There were no more cosmopolitan magazines available to be promised in marital negotiation, because the magazines were now under the operational supervision of the board, not the publisher. Millicent, in those same years, continued the Free Milk Fund. She continued the Met Opera Gala. She continued the Diamonds and the Mainbocher. She visited her grandchildren. She had, by 1947, 10 grandchildren. The eldest, Phoebe, was 20. The youngest, the future Patricia Campbell Hearst, would arrive in 1954. The architecture of the family Millicent had built around herself in New York was, by the late 1940s, more firmly entrenched than the empire her husband had once thought he could trade her out of. The price she had named in 1937 had not been paid. The marriage that Price had been intended to dissolve had instead settled into the long terminal phase that would end only with her husband's death. Chapter 8. The Castle. He could not climb. As the empire shrank and his body failed, William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon for the last time and arrived at a Beverly Hills bungalow that was, in every meaningful sense, the end of his road. The date of the last departure was the 17th of May, 1947. He was 84. He had been told by his physicians that the altitude of the San Simeon hilltop was straining his heart. He had been told, repeatedly across the previous 2 years, that he should move to a lower property. He had refused. He had, in the spring of 1947, suffered a cardiac event severe enough that further refusal was no longer possible. He was carried, on a stretcher, down the staircase from his bedroom in the Casa Grande and placed in a private ambulance. He was driven the 210 miles south to Los Angeles. He never saw San Simeon again. The Beverly Drive house had been chosen for him by Marion Davies. It was a one-story Spanish Revival mansion of approximately 20 rooms, far smaller than any of his California residences, but still vastly larger than the average American home. It had a swimming pool, a screening room, and a small staff. Davies moved in with him. The sons visited. Millicent did not. The arrangement was understood by all parties. The wife, who had not crossed the Mississippi in 21 years, would not cross it now, even with her husband 84 and visibly dying. The last 4 years of Hearst's life were quiet in a way the previous 84 had not been. He could not work full days. He could not climb stairs. He read newspapers, including, fastidiously, the ones he owned. He took calls from the Conservation Committee and from his sons. He dictated occasional editorials, which were taken down by a secretary. He could not write by hand, his vision having deteriorated to the point that even glasses no longer brought print into focus. He listened to the radio. He watched films at the screening room of the Beverly Drive house, the prints brought over from the studios at his request. He was, on the surface, an aging American newspaper baron in retirement. Beneath the surface, he was a man who had spent his entire adult life acquiring things, including the company of one of his wives, and who could now see, with all the clarity that approaching death provides, that he was about to lose the company of both of them. He was anxious about Davies. He had not been able to give her his name. He had not been able to give her a Catholic wedding, the only kind his wife's refusal to divorce had ever allowed him to consider. He had not been able to give her, in any legal sense, the position of consort that her 30-year companionship of him would, under any other arrangement, have earned. He could give her, however, money. He could give her stock. He could give her the closest approximation of a posthumous wife's portion that his corporate control allowed. In 1950, he established a trust for Marion Davies. The trust held 30,000 shares of Hearst Corporation stock, which by the valuation of the day was worth approximately $3 million, the equivalent today of approximately $37 million. The trust was an irrevocable transfer. The shares went to Davies. The income from them was hers for life. The principal would pass, on her death, to her named beneficiaries. The trust was the first installment of what he intended to leave her. The will he signed in early 1951, after several earlier drafts, contained the second installment. Davies would receive, on his death, an additional 170,000 shares of Hearst Corporation stock. The two transfers together, taking effect on his death, would put Davies in possession of 200,000 shares of Hearst Corporation common stock. The voting power of those shares, by the share structure of the company in 1951, was sufficient to give Davies briefly control of the company. He knew when he signed the will that the family would not allow the arrangement to stand. He knew that the sons would move, that the lawyers would move, that the conservation committee would move. He had built the will, in effect, as a final gesture of recognition to Davies that he understood the family could and would unwind. The signing of the will was, on his part, the last public act of his marriage to Marion Davies, the marriage that had never happened. He fell ill again in early August 1951. By the 12th, he was bedridden. By the 13th, he was unconscious for stretches of several hours at a time. Davies kept the vigil. She had been awake for 60 hours by the morning of the 14th. She had not changed her clothes. She had not left his bedside except to use the bathroom. She had been administered, at the insistence of the family doctor and at the request of the family, a mild sedative that did not work. She finally accepted a stronger one, late on the night of the 13th, and slept on a daybed next to the bed where he lay. He died at 9:45 on the morning of the 14th of August, 1951. He was 88. The family had gathered in Beverly Hills. The sons were present. Their wives were present. The lawyers had been alerted. Marion Davies was asleep in the same room, drugged into the deepest rest she had had in 3 days. According to several accounts, the family arranged for the funeral directors to arrive and remove the body before Davies woke. She woke to find the room empty. She was told by her secretary that William Randolph Hearst was gone. She did not attend the funeral. The funeral was held on the 22nd of August at Grace Cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral on Nob Hill in San Francisco, the Hearst family's church. Millicent Hearst, the widow, attended. She wore black. She sat in the family pew. The 5 sons sat with her. The grandchildren sat behind them. The pews behind the family held the corporate officers, the surviving political figures of Hearst's earlier life, and the press, including, naturally, every senior editor of every Hearst paper. The presiding clergyman was the Right Reverend Carl Morgan Block, the Bishop of California. The eulogies were given by Hearst's editorial associate Joseph Noland and by Senator Hiram Johnson. Noland called Hearst the man whose words had moved millions. Johnson called him the friend of the people. Neither speech mentioned Marion Davies. The press coverage the next day, including the coverage in the Hearst papers, did not mention her either. The funeral was a public confirmation for the country that the official woman in William Randolph Hearst's life had been, throughout, Millicent. He was buried at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Colma, California, the Hearst family plot, beside his father George and his mother Phoebe. The pallbearers were his 5 sons. The wife, who had not visited him at San Simeon since 1926, stood graveside in Colma on a foggy California morning and watched him buried among his own people. She had not seen him alive for several years. She had not lived with him for nearly 30. She had not, however, ever surrendered the title. The marriage that had begun on Holy Innocents' Day in 1903 had ended, 4 decades after its informal estrangement, on the family plot in Colma. The widow of William Randolph Hearst had become, for the first time in 25 years, the only woman in the country entitled to use the title. Chapter 9. The Will, the Stock, and the $1 Receipt. He died at dawn on the 14th of August, 1951, and within 11 weeks his mistress signed away 200,000 shares of the family company for a single American dollar. The mechanism by which Marion Davies surrendered the corporate control Hearst had attempted to give her is, in many ways, the cleanest single artifact of Millicent's lifetime strategy. The will had given Davies the shares. The shares had given Davies voting control. The control was, on paper, a position of immense practical power. Davies, with 200,000 shares in her name, could in theory have appointed corporate officers, directed editorial policy, and intervened in operating decisions across the Hearst Corporation. She did none of those things. What she did instead was sign the share transfer agreement of the 30th of October, 1951. The agreement transferred from Marion Cecilia Davies to Mrs. Millicent Hearst all 200,000 shares. The consideration, named on the agreement, was $1. The dollar was the legal price required for an enforceable transfer. The actual price had been negotiated between Davies's lawyers and the Hearst family lawyers over the preceding 10 weeks. The terms of that actual negotiation have never been fully made public. The various sources differ on the details. The general shape of the deal can, however, be inferred from the surviving correspondence and the subsequent settlement of Davies' own affairs. Davies received, in exchange for the shares, a written acknowledgement from the Hearst family that her existing trust holdings, including the 30,000 shares from 1950 and certain Hearst Corporation properties Hearst had previously transferred to her by gift, were uncontested. She received, in addition, peace. She received the family's withdrawal of any potential challenge to the assets she had already received from her lover across the previous 30 years. She received the family's assurance that the corporate machinery would not be turned against her in any retaliatory way. She received, in effect, the right to live out the rest of her life as Marion Davies, retired film actress and California socialite, without being pursued in court by the people whose father she had loved. What she did not receive was the company. The company went, by way of the share transfer, to Millicent and her sons. Marion Davies signed the agreement at her Beverly Hills home on the 30th of October, 1951. The Hearst family lawyers received the signed copy. The transfer was entered on the corporate books. The control passed back to the family. Marion Davies married Captain Horace Brown, a sea captain she had known for several years and who, by some accounts, physically resembled Hearst on the 31st of October, 1951, the day after the share transfer. The marriage was performed at her El Dorado ranch in Indio, California. The press coverage, including the coverage in the Hearst papers, was muted. The Hearst papers reported, factually, that Miss Marion Davies, the actress, had married Captain Horace Brown of San Diego in a small ceremony at her ranch. The papers did not say what every reader knew. The mistress of William Randolph Hearst, less than 3 months after the death of the man she had loved, had taken a husband. Davies kept Brown until her death on the 22nd of September, 1961. She died at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles of malignant osteomyelitis of the jaw, a rare bone cancer. She was 64. She was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in a marble mausoleum beside her sister, Reina Duras. She did not, even in death, reach the Hearst family plot in Colma. The legal architecture of the marriage Millicent had refused to dissolve held even at the cemetery. Millicent, 69 years old in October 1951, did not comment on the share transfer publicly. She did not comment on the Davies marriage publicly. She did not give an interview at any point in the autumn or winter of 1951 regarding the resolution of her late husband's estate. She continued to appear in her usual columns. She attended the autumn benefits. She wore the diamonds. She presided in the early winter over the annual Free Milk Fund Gala at the Metropolitan Opera House. The press coverage of the gala did not mention William Randolph Hearst. The press coverage did not mention Marion Davies. The press coverage described, in the usual language, the diamonds, the gown, the orchid, the guests, and the donations raised. The orchid that year, by one columnist's report, was a particularly beautiful one. The donations exceeded $1 million. The presentation continued. What had Millicent achieved in the 11 weeks between the death and the share transfer? She had achieved, in clean technical terms, the consolidation of the Hearst Corporation under her family line. The 5 sons were, by the autumn of 1951, in their 40s and 50s. The eldest, George, was 47. The youngest, the twins, were 35. They had been working in the company for 2 decades. They had been trained in part by their mother, and in part by their father's editors, to manage the various divisions of the corporation. They were ready to take operating control. They took it. The Conservation Committee was dissolved. The corporate trustees Hearst had named in his will were largely independent professionals selected to manage the trust under the will's terms. The trust's terms, by Hearst's own design, kept the company family controlled for as long as any grandchild alive at his death remained alive. The grandchildren, in 1951, ranged in age from infant to mid-20s. The arrangement would last, by reasonable actuarial projection, into the 21st century. It has. The Hearst Corporation today, 3/4 of a century after William Randolph Hearst's death, is still privately held and family controlled. The trust still operates under the original terms. The corporation has expanded across radio, television, cable, and digital media. Its estimated value, by the most recent published figures, is between $21 and $25 billion. The architecture of family control that Millicent's refusal to divorce had been quietly designed to protect has held for 3/4 of a century. The price she had named in 1937 had not been paid in 1937. The price had been paid in a different form in 1951. The price was the corporation itself. The widow of William Randolph Hearst could, by the December of 1951, look at the corporation her husband had built across 60 years and know that she had, by saying no 5 times in succession, secured it for the line she had carried. The chorus girl from the Herald Square Theater had inherited the empire by refusing for 30 years to walk away. Chapter 10. The Widow Who Did Not Need the Word. She was 69 years old when she became, in the eyes of the law, for the first time in 25 years, the only woman in the country entitled to use the title Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. She did not change anything about how she used it. The title had by then been used by her without interruption since the wedding of 1903. The only difference in legal terms between Mrs. William Randolph Hearst in 1950 and Mrs. William Randolph Hearst in 1952 was that the husband whose name she carried had moved from one state to another. Her own conduct of the title did not change. She kept the apartment at the Clarendon. She kept the Sands Point Country House. She kept the box at the Metropolitan Opera. She kept the chauffeur. She kept the seasonal rhythm of New York life that she had established in the 1920s. Winter at the Clarendon, summer at Sands Point, autumn at the racetrack, periodic short visits to Newport for charity, Paris for fittings every other year, London for the Royal Academy show in May. She kept the wardrobe. The main Boucher gave way across the 1950s to Charles James and to Pauline Trigère, and, eventually, to Christian Dior. The diamonds did not change. She continued the Free Milk Fund. She continued the mayor's committee work. She continued her board memberships. She added, in the 1950s, a new board, the Lighthouse Mission for the Blind in Manhattan, to which she had given quietly for years, and which now placed her on its annual benefit committee. She continued to be photographed in her box at the opera. She continued to give the brief annual speech at the Free Milk Fund Gala. She continued, in every column of every paper, to receive the description that had become her permanent media identity. Gracious, well-dressed, devoted, tireless. The press, which had refused for 30 years to ask after her husband, continued in widowhood to refuse to ask after the husband she no longer had. The storyline they had cooperated on for half her life was respected to the end. The sons aged. George Randolph Hearst lived until 1972 and died at 68. William Randolph Hearst Jr. continued his journalistic career and won, in 1956, the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for his coverage of the Soviet Union, the first member of the Hearst family ever to receive the award. John Randolph Hearst struggled with alcohol throughout his life and died relatively young in 1958 at 49. The twins Randolph and David continued in the corporation, with Randolph eventually becoming chairman of the corporation's executive committee. Grandchildren multiplied. Patricia Campbell Hearst, the second daughter of Randolph and Catherine Wood Campbell, was born on the 20th of February 1954. Millicent was 71. She held the new granddaughter on the day of her christening in the same way she had held her own first grandchild Phoebe in 1927. The press took the photograph. The press did not, by 1954, even need to caption it with explanation. The Hearst matriarch with the new Hearst granddaughter was a storyline of its own. She did not write a memoir. She refused multiple offers from publishers across the 1950s and into the 1960s. The most substantial of the offers, by reliable account, was from Doubleday in 1957 for an advance of $100,000, the equivalent today of approximately $1.25 million. She declined without explanation. She gave, throughout the period, no interviews. She kept, by all accounts, a small private correspondence with a handful of close friends. None of this correspondence has been published. Her closest companion across the last 2 decades of her life was, by friends' accounts, her sister, Anita Bertha Wilson, who had danced beside her at the Herald Square Theater in 1897, and who lived in the same building as Millicent at the Clarendon until her own death in 1968. The chorus line of 1897, in the end, outlasted everyone. Marion Davies' autobiography, The Times We Had been dictated by Davies in the late 1950s to the writer Pamela Fow. The book was held by the family lawyers after Davies' death in 1961. Negotiations to publish it dragged. Millicent did not, on the public record, comment on the book or its prospective publication. The book was eventually released in heavily edited form in 1975, the year after Millicent's own death. Davies' account of San Simeon, of Hearst, and of the Hearst family was warm and discreet. The book did not contain attacks on Millicent. Davies, like Millicent, had chosen not to fight the public war her circumstances had once seemed to demand. The two women, who had met only once and who had not spoken in person across 30 years of shared subject matter, had, in the end, decided independently to keep almost everything to themselves. The historical conclusion that the press, the biographers, and the eventual scholarship have all drawn from this is that the wife and the mistress in this particular American story were not, in their actual conduct, the rivals the popular imagination has made them. They were, both of them, women operating under structural constraints that gave them very few moves. Both moved with skill, both kept their counsel, both lived to a respectable age. Both refused to convert their private history into public theater. The drama, in the public sense, never happened, because both women refused to perform it. Millicent, by the late 1960s, was past 80. She had outlived Davies. She had outlived 3 of her own daughters-in-law. She had outlived several of her closest friends. She continued, with the slight reduction necessary to her age, the rhythm, the Clarendon, Sands Point, the opera, the Free Milk Fund, the diamonds, the orchid. The composed presentation that had been, for 60 years, the cover under which her actual decisions had been made. The widow had not, in the end, needed the word widow. She had always been Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. The title, once acquired in 1903, had been, by the steady force of her decision to hold it, the substance of every other position she had occupied. She did not need to declare that she had won. The architecture around her, in 1967 and in 1968 and in 1969 and on into the early 1970s said it for her. Chapter 11. The Granddaughter Who Did Not Come Home. In February 1974, a sound recording arrived at the Hearst family lawyers, and on it, Millicent's 20-year-old granddaughter declared that she had joined the people who had kidnapped her. The kidnapping had taken place on the 4th of February 1974, at an apartment Patricia Campbell Hearst shared with her fiancé Stephen Weed at 2603 Benvenue Avenue in Berkeley, California. 3 members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, a small armed leftist group based in the San Francisco Bay Area, broke into the apartment, beat Weed, and took Patricia by force, bound and gagged in the boot of a stolen car. She was driven to a safe house. She was held in a closet. She was, over the course of the next 2 months, subjected to a program of isolation, interrogation, and, by her own later testimony, sexual abuse. The case, from the morning of the 5th of February, was the most extensively covered American kidnapping since the Lindbergh case of 1932. The Hearst Corporation, by family connection and by professional necessity, was at the center of the coverage. Randolph Hearst, Patricia's father and Millicent's son, became the public face of the family across the months that followed. He addressed the press from the family home at Hillsborough, California. He read aloud the demands of the kidnappers. He negotiated through intermediaries with the SLA. The demands, after their initial monetary phase, included the establishment of a multi-million-dollar food program for the poor of California. Randolph Hearst funded the program. The program, designated People in Need, distributed approximately $2 million in food across several California cities in the early spring of 1974. The program did not secure Patricia's release. On the 3rd of April, 1974, 60 days after the kidnapping, the Symbionese Liberation Army released a sound recording. On it, Patricia announced that she had chosen, of her own will, to remain with her captors. She had taken, she said, the revolutionary name Tanya. She denounced her family, her fiancé, and the American government. The recording was played, in part or in full, on every major American news broadcast that evening. Millicent Hearst, at the Clarendon apartment on Riverside Drive, 91 years old, listened to the recording on her radio. By the accounts of the staff who were with her, she made no comment. On the 15th of April, 12 days after the recording, security cameras at the Hibernia Bank branch at 2276 Noriega Street in San Francisco captured Patricia Campbell Hearst, holding an automatic carbine, participating in the armed robbery of the bank by members of the SLA. The footage was released. The country watched. The federal government issued a warrant. Patricia Hearst was now, on the public record, a wanted fugitive. The American family she had been kidnapped from was the family whose name she had been baptized under and whose company she had been born to inherit a share of. She had repudiated all of it on a tape recording and, less than 2 weeks later, had appeared on bank security camera footage, holding a gun on the staff of the very institution her own family banked with. The press came back to the Clarendon. The press did not, in Millicent's case, gain access. She did not give an interview. She did not appear at the press conferences her son, Randolph, was giving. She did not, on the public record, say one sentence about the granddaughter, the kidnappers, or the situation. The family channel of communication ran through Randolph, then through his wife Catherine, then through the lawyers. Millicent, at 91, was permitted by the family to be left alone with the radio. What she thought, no one knows. The family accounts say only that she was, throughout the 8 months of the unfolding case, composed. She continued to take her meals at the usual hours. She continued to receive certain visitors. She read the newspapers, including her family's. She did not weep, at least not publicly, at least not before her staff. She did not, when asked by close friends, give any account of her inner state. The discipline that had governed every public statement of her life from 1903 forward governed also her response to the most public family crisis of her lifetime. She fell ill in the autumn of 1974. The exact diagnosis has not been published, but the contemporaneous accounts suggest a series of small strokes followed by a more substantial one in late November. She declined visitors. She refused additional medical intervention. She continued on the better days to read. She listened to opera recordings. She had her hair done by her longtime hairdresser on the days when she could sit up. She died on the 5th of December, 1974, in her bedroom at the Clarendon apartment at the age of 92. She had outlived her husband by 23 years. She had outlived Marion Davies by 13. She had outlived 3 of her own sons-in-law. She had outlived almost every member of her own generation of New York society. She had not lived to see her granddaughter's capture. Patricia Hearst was captured by federal agents on the 18th of September, 1975, 9 months after Millicent's death. The press coverage of Millicent's own death was less extensive than the press coverage of the granddaughter's continued fugitivity. The New York Times obituary, published on the 6th of December, was respectful and thorough. It described the marriage, the 5 sons, the free milk fund, the mayor's committee, the long Manhattan philanthropic career, the survival into her 9th decade as one of the city's leading hostesses. The obituary did not mention Marion Davies. The obituary did not mention the divorce negotiations. The obituary did not mention the share transfer of 1951. The obituary, in keeping with the long convention the New York press had observed across her entire adult life, treated her marriage as a private fact and her public work as the only basis for her public memory. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. The Cardinal Archbishop of New York presided. The pews were full. The 5 sons were the chief mourners. The grandchildren, with one famous exception, were all present. The granddaughter who was not present was, that day, in a federal safe house under a different name, still on the run. She had outlasted them all. She had, however, also outlasted the era of which she had been the great quiet survivor. The granddaughter on the run was not from her America. The granddaughter on the run was from a country that had, by the autumn of 1974, broken open in ways Millicent could no longer recognize. The chorus girl who had married the most powerful publisher in 1903 left a world her own grandchildren no longer entirely lived in. Chapter 12. The name that outlasted the empire. She refused to be buried beside him, and that final refusal said everything the 4 preceding decades had said by silence. The body was taken from the Clarendon on the 7th of December, 1974, to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The Hearst family plot in Colma, California, where William Randolph Hearst had lain since 1951, was not the destination she had chosen. She had, by every account, settled the burial plan years earlier with her own lawyers and her own clergy. She would lie in New York. She would lie under the name Hearst. She would not, however, lie in the family plot on the West Coast. The decision was not vindictive. She did not need vindication in 1974. She had, by the time of her death, possessed the legal title for 71 years, and had been the unchallenged widow for 23 years, and had been the matriarch of the surviving Hearst line for half a century. The decision to lie in New York was, by its very calm, the most articulate sentence she had ever spoken in public. The marriage she had not dissolved had taken her name and given her her sons. The marriage she had not dissolved had not, however, ever given her the right to be Mrs. William Randolph Hearst on his terms. She had taken the title on her own terms. She would lie down under her own terms. The funeral monument at Woodlawn is simple. The stone reads, in letters of moderate size, Millicent Veronica Hearst, July 16th. 1882 to December 5th, 1974. There is no reference to her husband. There is no reference to her marriage. There is no reference to her foundation. There is no reference to her vaudeville origins, or to her social position, or to her philanthropic contribution. There is only the name and the dates. The visitor who stands at the grave will not learn, from the stone, anything about who the woman buried beneath it had been. The empire, 2,500 miles to the west, has not stopped. The Hearst Corporation has continued, across half a century, to expand. The corporation today owns publishing, radio, television, cable, and digital interests. It is partner with the Disney organization and the cable network ESPN. It is partner with A&E Networks. It owns Lifetime. It owns Hearst magazines, which includes Cosmopolitan, Esquire, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, Good Housekeeping, House Beautiful, and many others. It owns Hearst Television, with stakes in 33 American local television stations. It owns the King Features Syndicate, the largest syndicator of newspaper comic strips in the world. It owns the Houston Chronicle, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Albany Times-Union, and other major American newspapers. The corporation's estimated value, by the most recent published figures, is between $21 and $25 billion. The family's stake in the corporation, controlled by the trust William Randolph Hearst established in 1951, is one of the largest single-family fortunes in the United States. The trust, by its terms, will remain in operation as long as any grandchild alive at the time of Hearst's death in 1951 is still living. Several of those grandchildren survived into the 21st century. The trust, in actuarial terms, will likely continue into the 2050s or beyond. Marion Davies' children's clinic at UCLA, opened in 1952, continues to treat children with congenital and severe medical conditions. The clinic is now part of the UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital. It bears her name. The Free Milk Fund for Babies, Millicent's foundation, was wound up in the 1960s as municipal nutrition programs absorbed its function. Its records are preserved in the New York City Municipal Archives. There is no monument to Millicent's foundation in the city she ran it from for half a century. There is no published biography of Millicent Hearst. There is no scholarly monograph devoted to her. She does not appear in the indexes of most general histories of the period. She appears, when she appears, in chapters and footnotes within the biographies of her husband, or in the more recent and more carefully researched biographies of Marion Davies, including Laura Gabrielle Fowler's Captain of Her Soul, published in 2022, which treats Davies with seriousness and Millicent with restraint. The wife, who had refused for 50 years to convert her private life into public material, has been rewarded by the publishing trade with the obscurity her conduct had earned. Marion Davies, who had also kept her counsel but had been the public companion of a famous man, has been studied. Millicent has not. This is the philosophical truth at which this documentary, like every Old Money Corrupts documentary, must arrive. Respectability in a country built on the appearance of virtue can outlast wealth itself. The wealth was William Randolph Hearst's. The love was Marion Davies's. The respectability was Millicent's. The respectability outlasted both of them. It outlasted his castle. It outlasted her clinic. It outlasted the marriage that had been its starting condition. It still exists now, in the legal architecture of the corporation her sons inherited, and in the trust her grandsons and granddaughters continue to direct. A name, once held, is the only piece on the board that does not have to be given back. Millicent had been given the name by her husband on the 28th of April, 1903. She had been asked repeatedly across the next 4 decades to give it back. She had refused. She had paid for the refusal. In social isolation she did not show. In private grief she did not name. In marital absence that filled half her life. And in the cost of being a public figure who could never speak about the matter that the public was most curious about. She had not, by any reasonable assessment, paid more than the title was worth. The title was worth, in the end, the empire. What do we owe Millicent Hearst? Not pity. She did not ask for it, not vindication. The dynasty she preserved does not need it. We might owe her, perhaps, one thing only. We might owe her the recognition that the wife the press refused to photograph beside her husband's mistress was not a victim, not a wronged woman, not a tragic survivor. She was a strategist. She played the long game. She did not lose. The men's names in this story are on castles, on newspapers, on a 30-room apartment on Riverside Drive, on a clinic in Los Angeles, on a corporation that has lasted 3/4 of a century, on a county on the West Coast, on a museum at Berkeley, on the front of the $10 bill of an earlier century. The wife's name is on a single small stone at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Hold it, say it, pass it along, Millicent Veronica Hearst. If this is the kind of story you would like to keep finding, subscribe so the next one reaches you when it lands. And tell me in the comments which moment in Millicent Hearst's 40-year refusal you think marked the real victory, the 1927 door. She closed on the first offer, the 1937 price she named that her husband could not pay, or the 1951 $1 receipt.